Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. So today we are going to be discussing vitamin D. We'll first define what vitamin D is, and then we'll cover the basic steps of vitamin D synthesis, how it moves throughout the body, and then how it interacts with different tissues to regulate different physiologic processes. Then finally, I'll give some examples of some common pathologies associated with vitamin D deficiency. Okay, let's first start by looking at the different types of vitamins. So vitamins are typically classified into two major groups, those that are water-soluble and those that are fat-soluble. Of the water-soluble group, we have vitamin C and all of the B vitamins. Now, these vitamins tend to be more transient in the body, and that's because they are going to follow water. So when water is excreted through sweat or urine, these vitamins are also going to be excreted from the body. The fat-soluble vitamins, on the other hand, such as vitamins A, D, E, and K, are taken up by adipose tissue. Now, that's important because an individual's body fat percentage and how much adipose tissue they have is going to affect how much of these vitamins they need on a day-to-day basis. But the good thing is these vitamins do tend to stay around for longer, so we typically don't need to take them as frequently as the water-soluble vitamins. Now, focusing just on vitamin D, we have two major forms, vitamin D3, which is really the focus of this video, and vitamin D2. Vitamin D3, also known as cholecalciferol, we typically get from UV light and diet, primarily animal sources, and vitamin D2, or ergocalciferol, is primarily obtained through plant sources. Now, as we'll see in just a moment, vitamin D is essential for maintaining bone health, as well as immune function and overall cell growth regulation. So now let's talk about how vitamin D is synthesized in the body. So I mentioned those two main sources where we get vitamin D from, such as sunlight and food, but we don't obtain vitamin D in its active form. Our body has to take a few steps to take this vitamin D that is inactive, that we get from sunlight, for example, and convert it into this active form of vitamin D that we can then use to regulate different processes in the body. Now, feel free to skip this one slide if you feel like this is beyond the level in which you need to know, but I'm going to mention a few chemical names, and there are a few enzymes in this process. Not essential to understanding vitamin D in the general sense, but again, I'm just going to go over this brief process, specifically looking at synthesis of vitamin D in the skin. So in the skin, we have this inactive form of vitamin D known as 7-dehydrocholesterol, and from UVB rays from sunlight and through heat, it will then be converted into vitamin D3. Now from there, vitamin D3 is transported to the liver in the blood, where it is then converted into 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, also known as calcidiol. Now, it takes one more step. Going to the kidneys, calcidiol is then converted into 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3. For the rest of this video, we'll just refer to this as vitamin D because this is the active form that most of us are going to be caring about. So from the kidneys, we can take this active vitamin D and send it to the target organs, typically being bone, intestine, and kidneys. And as we'll look at in just a moment, this whole process is really regulated by blood calcium levels and a hormone, parathyroid hormone, which is very important in regulating vitamin D synthesis and the action of vitamin D. Now, as far as dietary sources, so as I mentioned before, vitamin D is a fat-soluble molecule, so it's going to be bound to a lot of those non-polar fatty-like substances. So we typically see higher levels of vitamin D in fattier foods, so not necessarily foods that make you fat, but foods that have a higher fat content. So this includes dairy products, certain cereals might be fortified with different vitamins, and then fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, sardines. But these dietary sources of vitamin D are still going to follow this whole mechanism that we talked about in the previous slide. So whether we get vitamin D3 from that cholesterol precursor that we talked about being converted into vitamin D3, or we can get vitamin D3 from our food and it goes right into the blood, into the liver, through the kidneys, into the target organs. So whether we get vitamin D from the sunlight or from food, it's going to follow really that same pathway. There's just an additional step at the beginning for vitamin D conversion from sunlight in the skin. Okay, now let's talk about the primary functions of vitamin D in the body. So as I mentioned before, we have those two primary sources of vitamin D. We either get our vitamin D from food, or we get vitamin D produced by the skin by interacting with the UV rays from sunlight. Regardless of the source of vitamin D, eventually it is going to make its way to the liver, where through a few enzymatic steps, it will then be transported to the kidneys, where it is activated into our active form of vitamin D. From there, as I mentioned before, there's those three primary target organs, being bone, the kidneys, and intestines. Now, vitamin D is really essential for maintaining calcium and phosphorus levels in the blood, and that's its primary action. So when it interacts with bone, it's going to regulate, again, calcium and phosphate levels, which decides bone mineralization or bone demineralization. So when blood calcium levels are low, we're going to have bone demineralization. So the bone is going to break down so that calcium is released into the blood. And then when we have higher levels of calcium, we're going to add more calcium, more phosphorus onto bone tissue, and we're going to create bone mineralization. So vitamin D is essential to regulating bone mineral density. Now in the kidneys, it's going to regulate calcium retention. So the kidneys are the primary filter of our blood, the waste product being urine, and the kidneys typically decide which molecules that we want to hold on to or not excrete in urine. So when vitamin D interacts with the kidneys, it's going to cause the kidneys to hold on to more calcium so that we keep more calcium in our blood. Now in the intestines, that sort of third main organ that vitamin D interacts with, it's going to increase absorption of calcium and phosphorus. So again, we're going to be obtaining calcium and phosphorus from our diet as well. And the intestines, particularly the small intestine, vitamin D is going to increase the absorption of those two molecules so that we get more in our bloodstream. Okay, now let's take a look at the parathyroid glands and look at why they are important to regulating vitamin D activity and ultimately blood calcium levels. So here we have the trachea. The thyroid gland would be more anterior, more on the front side of, really around our neck, our throat. Parathyroid glands, we have 4 of them, 2 on either side, and they really sit just behind the thyroid glands. They're really small tissues and they only secrete one hormone, which is PTH, parathyroid hormone. Now, if we look at this diagram, here we have the parathyroid glands. They release parathyroid hormone, and it's going to do really 2 primary things. One is going to increase bone resorption. So we haven't talked about osteoclasts, but it's going to increase osteoclast activity, which really that just means it's going to cause bone breakdown. Now remember, when bone is broken down, the calcium and phosphate that makes up bone tissue is going to be released into the blood, so we have increased blood calcium. Now parathyroid hormone is also going to act on the kidneys, and it's going to increase that 1-alpha hydroxylase. It's just the enzyme that converts the inactive form of vitamin D from the liver into the active 1,25 dihydroxyvitamin D3. So parathyroid hormone is going to increase bone resorption or bone breakdown, and it's also going to increase conversion of the inactive vitamin D into the active vitamin D. So when we have more active vitamin D in the body, it's going to increase blood calcium levels through intestinal absorption. It's also going to help regulate, remember, the 3 primary tissues, bone mineralization, calcium retention, and intestinal absorption. So when blood calcium levels increase, we're going to have negative feedback, and we are going to get less parathyroid hormone release so that blood calcium levels are maintained. Again, the initial signal is when we get a drop in blood calcium, our parathyroid glands recognize that, will release parathyroid hormone, and then those are the two pathways in which parathyroid hormone will increase blood calcium levels. Okay, now let's look at some common pathologies associated with altered vitamin D or blood calcium levels. So the first example is osteoporosis or rickets. So as we mentioned before, vitamin D is important in regulating bone mineralization. So if you have inadequate vitamin D, you may not have proper mineralization of the bone matrix. So in children, we have rickets, which is really just bone deformities. And in adults, we have osteoporosis. So with osteoporosis, here we have normal tissue on the left and osteoporotic bone tissue on the right. You can see there's less bone density, so it's going to be more porous, and osteoporotic bone is not able to handle as much load as normal bone. So especially in older populations, we see an increased risk of fractures, especially with falls, and that is a huge health risk, especially in those older populations. Another example is muscle weakness and falls as well. So with decreased bone mineral density and decreased strength, we're going to see an increase in falls, especially in the older populations. So I only mentioned before that vitamin D is essential to bone mineralization, but there are also vitamin D receptors on muscle tissue. And it may not play as large of a role, but vitamin D is significant in promoting or regulating muscle growth and just muscle cell function. Now, some autoimmune diseases. So insufficient vitamin D levels are linked to an increased risk of autoimmune diseases, such as multiple sclerosis or MS and rheumatoid arthritis or RA. So there's some evidence that vitamin D plays a role in modulating the immune system and also preventing overactive immune responses. Now, psoriasis and inflammation. Vitamin D also helps control skin growth and inflammation. So a deficiency in vitamin D can worsen some of these conditions. So if someone already has an inflammatory disease or an autoimmune disease, low vitamin D levels it can help progress, I shouldn't say help, but can worsen those inflammatory and immune-like diseases. And then we have hyperparathyroidism. So low vitamin D levels can lead to decreased calcium absorption from the gut, which means there's decreased calcium in the blood. So this can trigger, sort of indirectly, a secondary hyperparathyroidism. So this condition is defined as a chronically elevated parathyroid hormone secretion, and that's just our body's way of compensating for the low calcium levels. And so this could potentially lead to bone resorption and weakening. So hyperparathyroidism, really, if we can't maintain or regulate high enough vitamin D levels, our parathyroid glands are going to compensate by pumping out parathyroid hormone to try and elevate those blood calcium levels, because we can't do that through vitamin D. And so then that may lead to decreased bone mineral density, muscle weakness, and all of these. They all kind of play on top of each other. They're intertwined. But overall, vitamin D is essential for maintaining those blood calcium levels, maintaining bone mineral density, maintaining skin health, immune health, as well as muscle strength and muscle cell function. So just to review what we learned today, we have our two primary sources of vitamin D. We get vitamin D2 or vitamin D3 from our food, our diet. And we also get vitamin D from our skin cells. When they interact with the UV rays from sunlight as well as heat, they are going to produce an inactive form of vitamin D. Both of these sources and their vitamin D contribution ultimately is going to make its way to the liver, and then it's going to be transported to the kidneys, where it is going to take its final enzymatic step in being converted into the active form of vitamin D, which is 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D3, or calcitriol. So from there we have our active vitamin D3. Really, its primary function is regulating blood calcium and phosphate levels, or phosphorus levels. So it does that by first interacting with the kidneys, so it can increase calcium retention, so we keep more calcium in our blood. Active vitamin D also interacts on the bone, so as we talked about before, vitamin D is really important for monitoring and regulating bone mineralization. So when calcium levels are low, the bone is going to be broken down so that we have more calcium being dumped into the blood. But when blood calcium levels are high, we're going to initiate bone mineralization. So we're going to add more bone tissue. And vitamin D is important for regulating that process. And then vitamin D is also going to help regulate and increase absorption of calcium and phosphorus from our diet. So overall, vitamin D is, when active and when used, it's going to increase blood calcium and phosphorus, which phosphorus and calcium have a number of important processes in the body, as we talked about: bone health, muscle health, cardiovascular health, immune health. So vitamin D is clearly essential to maintaining a number of important processes throughout the body. And then some examples of pathologies where we have deficiencies in vitamin D: we have immune and inflammatory diseases, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, where low vitamin D can worsen or progress those conditions. We have decreased bone mass and muscle mass, both of which are going to be significantly detrimental, especially in the older population where strength and bone mineral density is really important, especially protecting against falls. And then we also have other issues such as hyperparathyroidism, where our parathyroid glands are going to try and compensate for the deficiency in vitamin D. So if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. I hope you learned a few things about the significance of vitamin D in the human body. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more health and physiology related content. Also, leave a comment down below if there are particular topics that you want us to make videos on, and hopefully we can get those out soon. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next video.